Good morning. Welcome back to the Sunday Forum. It's so great to see everyone here, and welcome to all of you who are joining us online. I'm thrilled that you're here with us. Quick reminder for those of us who are in the room, if you have a question towards the end when we open it up, will you please come and use the microphone? It helps to include our folks who are online, and it helps to make the room accessible and the conversation accessible for those who have assisted hearing devices. So please use the microphone. You can't just yell into the room, please. Thank you. Let us pray. God of grace, we pray for the incarcerated, for those who are victims, and for our systems of justice. Teach us to treat people with the love and mercy that you show to everyone by your living example. Amen. So this morning, we have Jacquel Clemons, who is here, and she is the first director of the City of Atlanta's Office of Violence Reduction. It was a newly created office, I think last fall? Yeah, last fall. And so she is tasked with developing a strategic plan and coordinating programs to reduce and prevent violence. And she comes to us with a lot of experience. She previously served in Brooklyn, New York, but I'll leave that up to her to share with you a little bit about her experience there. But please help me to welcome Jacquel Clemons.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm so happy to have this conversation. Jacquel is a friend from New York, and I met Jacquel through CAVI, Kings Against Violence Initiative, in Brooklyn, where she developed and led the organization's public health strategies addressing violence and trauma. Now, the task she has in Atlanta is an enormous one, so if we just invited Jacquel here to pray for her and her office, I feel like that would be enough, but yes. If you could all put that on your prayer list. And what a worthy task to take on. She brings enormous experience to this space. So I'm really honored to welcome her here and to welcome her here, hopefully for a long time of friendship and working together with this congregation. So Jacquel, let's start with this, because the work you're taking on is so intimidating. And I think public health and how that connects to violence is also, it's a big topic. So let's start with who you are. Tell us about yourself. Tell us your story.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Reverend Wendy. Thanks for inviting me. I also would like to thank Elizabeth for your hospitality and for just being really open to this conversation. So I'm from New Orleans, so I'm a Southerner, and born and raised, and I know that today is like the day of all days for Atlantans and people who are from New Orleans. The Saints are playing here, and so do not hold it against me when we win this game, okay? All right?
That's not reducing violence.
Okay, yeah. All right. I know, I'm sorry, couldn't resist. But I'm from New Orleans, born and raised in the city. I was born in the city's third ward, where my grandmother was like really, she was a business owner, and she was really proactive in the community. And no issue was too large or too small for her to take on. She really used her power as a business owner to support those who are less fortunate. I come from a really big family where my grandmother, like unofficially adopted others. And so I have about like 13 aunts and uncles, 10 who were like my biological aunts and uncles, and another 3 that were people who like my grandmother raised. So like my duty to serve and to be in community with others and to support others really come from her. I'm also like, my background is in public health. I went to Clark Atlanta University here and went to New York for graduate school, where I really just got involved in activism around health issues and social determinants of health. And in that time that I was in New York, I lost one of my really good friends to gun violence, where this was a young woman who I went to Clark, Atlanta with, and she was shot by a stray bullet. And then that kind of like started getting me interested in how gun violence plays out in communities of color, particularly around like how could something like this happen to someone who isn't involved in anything like criminal, and she was on her way to pursue her PhD. I wanted answers, and so I started doing like some research about the public health approach to gun violence. It was an emerging science at the time, and not many people were doing work around like gun violence and public health and looking at gun violence from a public health perspective. And so my young mind was just trying to reconcile how could this happen? How could this happen to someone who, like, if you knew Shawnee, you would know that, like, she was a saint. She was really like the person who kept my friend circle on the straight and narrow when we were in school. And so, like, I just wanted to make sense of it. But then it was a thing that would happen again and again and again as I grew up and as I became a young adult, where I was losing people around me to gun violence. And so in about, I want to say maybe 2015, my friend Dr. Robert Gore, who also went to Morehouse College, is an emergency medicine physician at a busy hospital. It's the equivalent of Grady in Brooklyn. And Dr. Gore reached out and was like, Jacquel, like, I know you're in Atlanta. I was here working at Mercy Care at the time. And he was like, listen, like, I really want to do something around gun violence and public health. And like working in the hospital, what I'm seeing is just, it's unreprehensible. Like I can't continue to serve in this way and not do anything. And so I joined with Dr. Gore at Kings Against Violence Initiative in Brooklyn. So I left Atlanta, went to New York, and began working to build out a public health approach to gun violence for Brooklyn, and use that work to, scale the organization. Reverend Winnie was at Trinity Wall Street at the time, and we were having conversations with funders, with whoever would listen about healing, about the opportunity for healing, about the fact that like we were talking about gun violence, but we were not talking about it from a trauma-informed approach. We weren't talking about it from a restorative approach, and that it was really just rooted in like the criminal justice side of this, and we wanted to turn that conversation on its head. And during that time, we met Reverend Winnie, and Trinity was one of our actual seed funders. They were preparing to do a lot of vanguard work around how do we enter into these restorative spaces. While working there, I managed to lead some really amazing legislation that led to funding for the small organizations that were doing the work around gun violence in communities. We scaled the organization. I then came back to Atlanta a year before COVID. Working remotely to take care of my dad. And was working remotely and supporting the organization. This opportunity became available. And so I, during that time, married, had a baby. I'm a mom of 3 wonderful little girls. Reverend Winnie and I was over here laughing earlier about how ingenious one of my oldest girls are and the type of snacks that draw them in. But I'm a mother. I am a servant. This is service work for me. I feel like this is my mission. And I'm really excited to be leading this Herculean task of building power here in Atlanta around how do we not only reduce violence, but how do we come to the center again. So.
Amazing. Mercy Care was here, is that right?
Yeah.
So get this, Jacquel Clemons used to work in this building in what is now the Sunday school floor.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It was in the basement.
Yeah, so
Is
Sunday
that the
school
Sunday
and
school?
where Crossroads is, with Mercy Care. So was here. St. Luke's is happy to claim everybody. I think we get to claim Jacquel as well.
Yep, you do.
Which is amazing. So let's talk about what restorative justice is. I want us to understand that. So We're all, I think, well aware of the issue of gun violence in this city and violence in this city and crime in this city. That's in the news all the time.
Yeah.
What does it mean to think about restorative justice in light of the kind of violence we have in our city?
I love RJ. I love restorative justice. When I think about restorative justice, I think about it being a practice. I think of it as just like a way of being. I think that when I consider what it means to be restorative, it means to consider the ways that we undo the harm. And I honestly feel like it's about creating, restoring, and sustaining relationships with the same sort of grace that God extends to us. So I think that it's a really wonderful practice and a really beautiful way of being in community with each other. I think, when we oftentimes think about restorative justice, it's often about a victim and the driver of violence or the driver of harm. But I think that it's a way of just being in community with each other. And so when I think about the work that's ahead for me, what really comes to mind is that we have to resist being victims and in judgment of, that we have to really consider the type of ways that we would want to be held and supported. And, this is probably a little woo-woo for government, but in my role, I really feel like part of what I'm being charged and tasked to do is to help figure out, how do we bring healing into the spaces where a lot of harm has been done.
So maybe to help me think about this, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. No. What I remember about Kavi, you and Dr. Gore, is that there were circles of young adults who were from the communities of these young people that he kept just finding it as an emergency. So the way he would describe that is he was in there just patching up people's bodies to go back out and be shot again or to shoot again, right? They were in these, just in communities where there was so much violence happening. And so you all went into those schools and just created circles of just a whole bunch of kids. Yeah. And then basically wrapped around them while building skills and relationship with them. So tell us about that.
So the process of healing circles is really this slow and intentional listening, right? And the slow and intentional listening, and we would do that with young people, with families who've experienced gun violence after a violent incident. We would go into communities and host healing circles with community members. And it was a space for people to process what oftentimes doesn't get processed in community with each other. We process these things in silos by ourselves with maybe someone else, but we never do it together, right? And so the work that we did in New York that I hope to also bring here, and we've done some healing circles here, is to host circles and use circles as a space where we get to be slow and intentional and thoughtful and listen and hear. And not just hear from, people who have been directly impacted by violence and that they're the person who experienced it themselves, but that people who've been exposed, people who are bystanders, people who are just feeling it just because they love where they live. I think that those types of conversations are really important because it gives us an opportunity to hear different perspectives. It gives us the opportunity to check in with each other, which we oftentimes don't do. And in those spaces, what we uncovered so much was that there was so much deeply entrenched trauma that was happening with our kids at a very young age that we weren't addressing. And that trauma was sometimes simply from exposure, We talk about violence from a public health perspective. And so if you think about violence as a contagion, it's something that passes, right? And so the exposure, what we see on TV, what kids are witnessing, the mental gymnastics around navigating environments so that you can keep yourself safe was a real thing for so many young people. And I'm thinking about something Elizabeth and I just was talking about the brain science of that, right? Like, what happens to a developing mind when this is something that you are repeatedly exposed to? And then it's not processed. And so we would use circles as our way to kind of like bring young people to the middle and kind of bring them into a communal space where there were people who actually like just sat with them and listened. It wasn't an opportunity to like react. It was a space where like if a young person decided that like today I don't feel like engaging. And a lot of the young people who we engaged with were the ones who, I had one principal say to me that his school was a bidirectional feeder for Rikers Island.
Oh my God.
And this was my favorite school. The kids in there were amazing. They were totally responsive to the restorative process that we put into place. They loved the circles. They loved coming to the circles when there was a conflict that they couldn't resolve and they knew that a fight was brewing. They would bring it to us and ask us to have conversations with them about how to mediate that conflict. It's a space that I think allows for people to sharpen their social emotional skills, those skills that we kind of like, don't really foster and develop in schools. But it's a really harmonious space. I think that it was one of the first spaces that we would use to kind of create community. And then we would say, okay, so this is a circle and this is your first circle. And if there is no harm that you're causing here, we now want you to think about the concentric circles that surrounds this circle. What does it mean to not cause harm in the school? What does it mean to be a messenger of not causing harm in your community? And that was changing. It shifted so much in so many of our kids.
Okay, so one, that's very beautiful. So I'll ask unbeautiful questions. And I have two. You can answer them how you want to answer them. One, is there any impact of that circle, or does the circle include the person who's caused the harm? And then two, like to that point, like the thing we measure is harm, and you're in government now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And public health people are notorious for how well they measure.
Yeah, you measure.
What do you measure in this kind of work?
That's a great question. So, yes, first question. Sometimes in those circles would be the person who has caused harm. Absolutely. Sometimes we will be intentional about bringing the person who has caused harm into those spaces. Especially in school settings where there's we're trying to avoid a kid being pushed out of the school. And by pushed out, I mean being suspended or transferred to another school where their safety is yet again changed and shift. So we would bring them to those circles and we would use that as an opportunity to avoid suspension. So yes, we would bring, and there are lots of models of restorative justice where victims and drivers of violence are oftentimes in those circles. And I think that there are some spaces here in Atlanta that's actually using RJ in that way. And then in terms of measuring, we, this data question oftentimes come up. I think that for government, we use crime stats to kind of talk about the ways that that we reduce violence. But there's a lot of things that I think we have to consider, especially as we build a model for gun violence intervention strategies. I think we have to also count what we prevent and what's preventable. In our schools and in the spaces that I've been in, traditional measures for how do we measure if we're successful or not just did not work. A lot of the times, we were mostly interested in just trying to ground a young person and to help them to achieve some sense of stability around their emotional state so that they're not always heightened, right? And so how do you measure that? I've worked intensely with students at SUNY Downstate School of Public Health to find measures for sense of safety, sense of self-worth. I was really interested in increasing young people's ability to partner with adults, to be in partnership, and that was a kind of a foreign concept in the system that was very hierarchical, right? Schools is you listen, you're told what to do, we don't hear you, we don't see you. And so, we wanted to measure in a different way, and so a lot of what we looked at were not like the academic gains, how many students graduated. Like that was a win. Like we were really excited about kids who were like achieving academic gains, but that was the least of our concerns. Really what we wanted to know was that like we increase the young person's ability to think about their emotional state, that we were able to convince them that their long-term thinking needed to be a part of the equation when they were being approached with conflict. And so we, like in science, there's all these like different measures that has to be like tested and validated. And so we tore apart a lot of those measures and found the things that resonated with us and used that to measure success, as opposed to like the things that are traditionally measured. And like I am pushing for here in Atlanta for me to be able to look at some of our gun violence intervention strategies as the prevention things that we're collecting and doing as also measures of success. In addition to crime stats, that's important, but there are other things that we have to consider as well.
So just to make sure I understand this correctly, so the things you want to measure are basically implementing the program itself would be something that
Yeah.
So your program is kind of seems based on the idea that trauma impacts how you think about what your choices are. And I was in a conversation a few days ago with some friends who were saying, trauma is the most overused word we have. Like all of us are. Someone said they almost hit a deer and mentioned it at the next stop. They went to a grocery store, almost hit a deer, go to the grocery store. A little rattled, said to the person at the counter that they were a little rattled, apologized, almost hit a deer. That poor child said, "Oh, you're traumatized. I would have taken the day off." Right? Like that's not quite what trauma is, right? Like life is full of hard things.
Right.
Help us understand a little bit what trauma is and what these responses are that you're trying to offset or change.
I think that in regards to gun violence, I think we oftentimes underestimate adverse experiences and the impact that it has on brain development, right, Elizabeth? And I think that violence, neglect, accumulated harm leads to like this excessive activation, right? Like we're heightened and we're responsive and we're reacting. And I think that that's trauma, and I think that the implications of it has far-reaching impact that we don't sometimes want to reckon with. And that impact can impact our health, it can impact opportunities, it can impact, conditions in our communities. And I think that that's what I'm contending with, right, in my role. I think that, we really, we might be overusing it, but I think that is a real thing that has just gone unaddressed for so long. And like so many of our like systems, I mean, there's a scientist at Emory who is looking at ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And he has there's a map on this IPRICE.org. It's at Emory, but he has a map, and this map goes from a gradient of light blue to like dark black. And if you go on this website and you pull up this grid, this map, it shows you Atlanta, and on the map it shows you like where there's been adverse childhood experiences. And and I think about like trauma, I think about there's little traumas, there's middle traumas, and there's like really big traumas, right? And this map, the gradient of this map was like the Atlanta area. So like the darker color was like, that there was big traumas, right? And lots of trauma. This map was pretty much covered in like from like maybe like a blue to like a dark black, most of it. Everywhere. So
for trauma, do you mean like what is it, like poverty, abuse in the home, violence around you? Like what?
I mean, ACEs could be anything from adverse childhood experiences are ACEs. They use this scoring, this measure in public health to determine like how much adversity you've experienced in your life, right? And so it can be anything from like, experiencing your parents separate or move. I mean, I know moving for me was traumatic. Was it for you? Right?
No comment.
In the middle of a pandemic. But I mean, the pandemic, right? Like, I mean, so it can be like so many different things. Like I said, there's big traumas, little traumas, but this map is pretty much covered. And what it brought, like, for me, it brought to the front of mind for me, and was a real aha moment. This is maybe 2 weeks ago. It was like, oh my goodness, like, all of our systems are not responding in a way that supports this type of trauma, right? Like the way that we ask questions, the way that we, do an intake or triage a patient, like we have no idea like what type of things. And I think that like we look at each other and we're just kind of like, oh, the kids are all right, everybody's okay, right? And with no real like regard for like what someone's experience might be. And so I think that, like what's the lift for me is kind of like figuring out like as a system, what's a whole government response to that so that we can reduce violence. And, it's not the traditional ways of enforcement. And I think that like gun violence in general tends to be like a divisive topic. I think that the solutions to it also kind of like can have some intense division there as well. But I think that, like we can't talk about how gun violence is happening in our city and not talk about the harm and not talk about the root causes and not think about the way that trauma is impacting them.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, so don't answer if you don't want to.
Okay.
But would you, is access to guns something we can, the control of access to guns, something that could that potentially impact the kind of gun violence we see?
I definitely think so. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I'm going to let you all ask questions in just a second, so get ready. So if I take this map that you've just described, and I haven't seen it, it makes sense to me that if I just counted COVID and nothing else, that we're a rattled people, right? Nothing else. If everything else was equal, how do you begin to take on? So this isn't just that there's certain neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence. This is part of what's interesting in Atlanta, that it's not as in New York. I didn't live in neighborhoods where I had to worry about gun violence. You could do that. Yeah. I don't know that that's true in this city in quite the same way, which is fascinating. But how do you think about your work with what you've just described? Yeah.
I think that we're all grappling with like what safety looks like. Yeah. But I do think that there are some communities that are grappling in a very different way.
Yeah.
I'll just speak to like, I started to tell you this, Reverend Winnie, but there was this young man who had approached me at a vigil for there was a shooting, and you all may have heard of it, I'm sure it was on the news. It was a 7-year-old little girl who was shot at Rose Burney Park in Mechanicsville. Mechanicsville it's like one of the most amazing communities. It's like you talk about familiar faces, the same people you see all the time. Dunbar Rec Center is there. I really enjoy being there because there's a cure violence program that's there. This particular intervention that's happened at Chris 180 is really great, and the community members are amazing. But this question is making me think about that community right now because there's a young man that I met at a vigil. His name was T-Rock, Terrence. Terrence, I met him the first time at a community mural. They were putting a mural up in their community. I think environmental design, doing things in the community is a great way to kind of combat gun violence in the community. When people can take pride in where they live. So I went to this event that this group had did, and I met him there. And he lost his son, maybe 4 days. I think he said it was like 4 days after that. T-Rock was at the park the day that shooting happened, right? And he saved that little girl's life. He's like an unsung hero. Nobody talks about what he did, but he essentially, like, the ambulance couldn't make it to the field. He picked her up and brought her to the ambulance. I saw him at our vigil, or at the vigil for the people who passed, and the community rallied to just say, look, they want peace, and they want to make sure that there's things that, like this that's not happening. And he was like, listen, you need a foot soldier? I got you. Like, I really want to do this work with you, right? T-Rock was murdered this week. Oh. And I was just like, really struggling with, like, how does this happen? Like, it's so, I mean, like, he lost his son, he saved this little girl, and then he lost his life. And I'm thinking about him this morning. I'm thinking about the people who've been, like, trying to pull him out of the life that he was in. And I don't know the circumstances of, like, how he died, and for me, it doesn't really matter. But what I know is that this was a young man who wanted to do something different, who wanted to, like, you know, come to the brave and bold call of being a violence interventionist. Mm-hmm. And he lost his life. And so I say that because I know that, like, there's communities that certainly is feeling like the brunt of gun violence and threats to their safety. Yeah. And I know that there's other communities that are, like, experiencing crime and violence in a different way. And I can't help but talk about, like, how disproportionate it is, but, like, I know we're all experiencing it, right? Like, I mean, I worry about my own safety and my kids' safety. I'm a mother, you know, an aunt. So, like, you know, these things are real, but I think that there are definitely some communities that are experiencing this in a more disproportionate way. And so my work first is to make sure that, like, those communities, like, you know, that we stop the bleed. That we stop the bleed there, and that we do the work there. But simultaneously, there's multiple pots to stir, right? And so there's things that I think that we can do in terms of, like, you know, there's so many assets that we have in terms of institutions and each other, people, right? Like, how do we build on our own empathy? How do we have, like, conversations with ourselves about, like, you know, like, I have to check my privilege oftentimes. Like, I live in a nice, cushy neighborhood in DeKalb County. My kids are able to attend private school. So, like, I have to check my privilege sometimes at the door and say, hey, you know, like, again, you can't be victim and judge. You know, like, do I want this to end? Absolutely. But I also feel like I have to lend some understanding to, like, why it's happening, why the T-Rocks of the world are dying, and our communities are being ravaged. Communities like Mechanicsville being ravaged with gun violence, and, you know, it's a hard task sometimes, but I think that you know, it's something that I have to reconcile with often. It's that, like, you know, like, where do I focus my attention? Where do I begin?
Well, that image that you have of stirring multiple pots, you only have 2 arms that I can see.
Yeah.
So again, two more questions that you can decide how you want to put together. One is, tell us about your team. So who are you working with? But then the second one, I know, it's because I think that might be a quick answer. The second would be, you've both moved legislation. You've written it. You've seen it pass, right? You've moved legislation, and you've also built programs.
Yeah.
How do you see your work in the next year in those 2 spaces?
Yeah. So my team. Well, right now it's me, and I have a part-time deputy director. His name is Dr. Michael Cleary. He's an emergency medicine doctor at Grady. He's wonderful. And I've been lucky enough to be partnered with Benjamin Cahardy, who leads justice initiatives for the city of Atlanta. He's a policy director there. And so and then Megan Sparks, who is like over strategic initiatives. And so the four of us together, like, are conspiring to do some really great things. I would say, like, over the next year or so, I'm working to do a lot to build awareness about what this work looks like. Yep. I think that piece is critical. We grounded this work in Peace Week. I don't know if you all were part of or had an opportunity to participate, but there's going to be another one in Peace Week. But one of the things that Mayor Dickens, when we first met, he heard me say was that, like, I really want to start my work in talking about what it means to be peacekeepers and peace ambassadors. And so we're going to be doing another Peace Week in October. Oh, and right. Yeah. I also think that, like, you know, we're hoping to fund several organizations locally. We're incubating small grassroots organizations. There's a lot of people who want to be responsive to this work, but don't have the capacity to do it or the infrastructure. And so we're building those organizations. I'm brokering a lot of deals with, like, you know, with funders, with people who are interested in supporting organizations. And I'm doing a lot of, I'm hoping to build that work out so that those organizations next year will be able to find. We're rolling out 2 cure violence initiatives in Southwest Atlanta and in Northwest Atlanta. Those initiatives hopefully will be launched in October. We've identified the organizations. We're hoping to just sign contracts soon. But I think that in all of that, like in funding these orgs and funding this work, it's really like building out an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is comprised of, like, healing resources, churches. So we hope to build a clergy council. Yes, I got a yes over there. I think clergy could be a wonderful asset in this work. And there's some really great groups that are doing work with clergy that we're bringing here to the city that are friends from New York to support the build out of what it means to have clergy to be responsive. We're also, like, you know, hoping to engage in conversations because this is about changing hearts and minds, right? And so that influence around changing hearts and minds oftentimes with the people who, you know, us talking to each other, right? So public health is called popular opinion leaders. So we're recruiting popular opinion leaders to have a
room full of popular opinion leaders, right? Yeah.
To have conversations with each other about, like, what this means, what this work means. What does it mean to kind of stem the tide on gun violence? And how do we do that as neighbors? Like, how do we do that as not just, you know, like one area of town? Like, we're all Atlantans. Like, we all live here. This is all of our community. And so that's the work that I'm leading in the next year, building out evaluation. I hope to have a robust evaluation. Measuring is important so that we can say, like, this is working, you know. So, yeah.
Amazing. I've gone too long. I apologize, but if someone's got a question, you got to go to that microphone. Neil's got a question, and just stay there. Don't sit down if you've got a question. So
Mike, when you started talking and I saw this subject, I thought of a person. Many of you've heard the name H. Rap Brown of a bygone era. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Interesting. These younger kids.
Crazy kids.
H. Rap Brown made the statement probably 40 years ago, violence is as American as apple pie. Yeah. There is a value system. And when he said that 40-some years ago, he probably had no idea of what he was saying compared to the amount of violence. So that's just a backdrop of where we are in this country. It is a value system. I'm going to ask you two things. One, is it a value system? And then a separate question, somewhat tangential to that, but how does this organization interface with the police department and what it is doing to try to prevent violence, as gang task force and all these kind of things? So the first thing about HRAP, forget that. How do you interface? How do you interface with the police department and other forces that are attempting to deal with violence as a value system?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. No, I don't know HRAP, but I'll do a Google search on him when I get home. I have a very close relationship with with the chief of the City of Atlanta's police department, and Chief Shearbaum was actually like one of the folks who interviewed me, and was really excited about my role in this position. I think that there is an over-reliance on the police, and I think that like he would be in agreement with this to solve this problem, right? There's like so many different gun violence intervention strategies that are amazing and impactful, that are place-based, that are like people who live in those communities, like a T-Rock being able to talk to a young person and take the gun out of the hands of a young person, right? Who can mediate conflict, who can, encourage a young person to consider, or a person, because I think that we think about gun violence and we think that it's all youth, and it's not. Here in Atlanta, 24 to 36 is the age group that mostly is victims and perpetrators. But I hope to work very strategically with them, Neil, and very closely with them. We're getting ready to do, speaking of data, we're getting ready to do a gun violence problem analysis where we're looking at our homicide data, a very deep dive. We want to understand networks. We need that information in order for me to decide, like, what are the strategies moving forward? Where do I need to be? Who are the groups that I need to be working with? We're doing shooting reviews, and as a part of the shooting reviews, usually with a shooting review, you review data of just the person who was the actual perpetrator, but I want to know about the victims as well, because I think that there's something that's very telling about who may have been impacted by this or who may have touched the system. And by systems, I mean systems, because there's a stat that's out that's going around in this gun violence prevention world that I'm in that talks about before there's a non-fatal shooting or a homicide, that person may have touched 7 different systems. So that means that there's 7 different opportunities for grace, 7 different opportunities to redirect. And so I'm hoping to use a lot of the data that our police department has to develop strategies and to work closely with them on what type of strategies they can implement to do call-ins for people who persist in crime, and to implement a strategy that's called focused deterrence. So yes, I'm working very closely with APD. I do see this being a blended approach as opposed to non-enforcement, enforcement, but us working in tandem. Thank you for your question.
Really intimidating standing up here. So I feel like I'm missing a really fundamental picture of what gun violence is. As a person of much privilege, admittedly, and I think I'm not alone in this, I've really been insulated from this. And I lived in Kings County for 10 years, and I was insulated from it then too. And so I kind of feel like I'm also a parent, and the conversation around gun violence, lately has been so focused on mass shootings, which is just not that common. And it feels like, I suspect, it's kind of obscuring the reality of what gun violence is. And so I apologize, but I wonder if you could sort of back way up and explain what is sort of the landscape of gun violence that is actually happening in our city.
Yeah.
And then if there's time, how can we, as people who maybe don't live even near these communities that you're mostly working in, how can we support your work? So
thank you. That's a great question.
Pastor Jacqueline, do you know how to contact Terry Crews? He was with Brooklyn Nine-Nine in Brooklyn, the TV show Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
No, I don't know how to contact Terry Crews.
Pastor, can you help me get in contact with
Let's-
Pastor Bacon?
Let's do that after we finish this session. We'll do that after.
Thank you for your question. So gun violence in Atlanta, last year we had 158 homicides. And for every homicide, what you can imagine is there's probably at least 2 non-fatal injuries, right? So that number then triples. So, I mean,
Every day.
Yeah, it's underreported. So about 80% of violent injuries. So when I talk about violent injuries, I'm talking about intentional injuries, gunshots, stabbings, assaults, even intentional burns. About 80% of them are underreported in that they're seen at a level 1 trauma center or at a hospital, but it's not reported to the police. In 2021, violence became the #1 cause of death of all U.S. children. And it has long been the #1 cause of death for Black adolescents. So it's extremely disproportionate. And what I will say is that, like here in Atlanta, it's happening in pockets. So like the northwest, like the northwest region of Atlanta, southwest Atlanta, southeast. So like that Mechanicsville, like I think of it as kind of like a rainbow in terms of like how it's spreading, right? So if you think about like East Atlanta, kind of spanning over Thomasville, kind of then coming over to like, I guess that's like the Mechanicsville area, like kind of central to the city, but east of the city. Southwest Atlanta, so like MLK corridor. It's happening a lot over there. And it's prevalent. It's prevalent, it's predictable, which means it's also preventable, right? So like and it drives this it's driven by disparities. So like where we're seeing, I think that AJC recently did an article about dangerous dwellings, right? These dangerous dwellings, these communities where there's dangerous dwellings are also seeing like a real spike in gun violence. But it's the conditions. It's the conditions that's really fueling that. And so I think that that's something for us to consider. And I think that your question was what ways or how do you talk about it? I think you talk about it from a space where, like, I mean, as a mom, I like try to help my kids understand that, like, you know, there's that we need to be careful about judgment, and that we need to try to like seek to understand, and so I talk about root causes with them. I talk very plainly about like how this happens disproportionately in different communities, and the things that insulate us from these conditions and these spaces are things like education, and that mommy has had access to opportunities. It's a hard conversation to have. And if I may just share, like I lost my nephew to gun violence. Christmas Day 2020. And he was 14. He went to Walgreens running behind cousins who were going to Walgreens because he wanted a candy bar. And it was random. And we have never been able to really talk about, like up to that, I was never really able to talk with my daughter about like why I did what I did in terms of my work. But, you know, like for so many Black and brown children, like this becomes reality no matter like what the distance is. And I think that is becoming a reality for like Americans, no matter like what the distance is from those conditions, right? Or from like our privilege, like we're watching mass shootings happen. And I think we do have to have like real conversations about like the root causes of this. And it means that, you know, like some different values, speaking boldly and bravely to like what we're seeing, and being able to let them and to let them know that, like, you know, we do what we can to protect them, but there is this whole big world out there, and that's the reality of it, and that we hope that you know, like we pray a prayer of protection, and that prayer will keep us, and that we have to have faith. But I do think that is one of those things that we have to speak truth to. So,
Thank you, Jacquel. Some of us have to get ready for the next service. I'm going to put Ann Kramer in charge of making sure that Jacquel gets to wherever she needs to be next. Can you help me thank Jacquel Clemons for being with us this morning?
thank you.
And don't worry, she'll be back. There's a lot more to talk about. You know, one of the principles I've been taught is we don't get to be safer than the most vulnerable people in our communities, and that is a painful, painful reality. I think that is sitting closer to a lot of us these days. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Reverend Winnie.